Thank you for joining us here again at Perpetual Assets. I'm one of the managing partners of Perpetual Assets, Gus Demos, and I'm very thrilled today to have our special guest with us, someone I've been following for a long, long time, Joel Skousen from joelskousen.com, World Affairs Brief, author of Strategic Relocation, author of The Secure Home, and just a plethora of knowledge, be it geopolitical, self-reliance, financial, economic, etc. Mr. Skousen, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Gus. It's always good to be with you.
Thank you. I wanted to start off with current events and what's been dominating the news the last 2, 3, 4 weeks is the Syria and Iran situation. So I wanted to not only get your thoughts on what you thought of it from a geopolitical standpoint, but what's the game here? Who's playing who are the players involved, and how do you think this plays out?
Well, first of all, Syria is not about democracy at all. There's never been a democratic reason for intervening in any of these countries, especially after the U.S. has played ball with their tyrannical governments for decades, and then all of a sudden they have a democratic moment where they want to impose democracy. But it's not about democracy. It's about rearranging the chess pieces in the Middle East relative to Israel. The focus is on Iran. Iran is the only Middle Eastern Muslim country that is directly attempting to achieve independence and self-sufficiency in its own weapons systems. Now, the Muslims generally have been what we call cannon fodder in geopolitics. They're used by Western and Eastern powers to play off one another, but never allowed to get enough power themselves to operate independently. The days of the Ottoman Empire ruling by the sword and a little bit of cannon is over. It takes modern, sophisticated weapons, and none of the Arab or Muslim nations have their own indigenous weapons industry except Iran. And that's why Iran has to go, so that it cannot be independent of Western or Eastern powers. Now, be that as it may, the reason that the Syria was targeted first, I might say as an afterthought that the globalist powers that be have tried to get Israel to attack preemptively Iran since 2004. That's the first intelligence we have about a meeting in London where they talked about how disappointed they were that Israel hadn't taken on Iran yet. And a lot of it was because, they just were worried about how it would look if they were directly aggressive. They had to beef up the propaganda about the supposed nuclear program before they could justify an attack. It's just taken a long time. The Iraq war and Afghanistan got in the way as well. But then it was decided last year that it would be easier on Israel if they're going to do a preemptive strike on Iran. And the purpose of that, by the way, is to induce retaliation so that the U.S. could immediately join in with Israel without being blamed as having started it. But Israel has always been worried about the retaliatory capacity of Syria. It has more retaliatory capacity than Iran does in terms of missiles, both conventional warheads and chemical warheads. And that's why Syria was targeted. If you can take out the retaliatory capacity, Israel could get away nearly scot-free by attacking Iran and could survive much of that. Part of the reason for destabilizing Egypt as well was to curtail its retaliatory capacity against Israel in that regard. So what happened this past week was a major setback for the globalist agenda. In an off-the-cuff remark to a reporter's question, is there any way that Syria can avoid this kind of military intervention, which everybody in the world saw that the globalists who control Barack Obama, and he's not running the show, by the way, but his main handlers in the National Security Council, being globalist, were intent on using this justification of chemical attacks, which was wrongly attributed to Syria. It was the rebels. The gas was provided by Saudi Arabia to the Syrian rebels, and the U.S. provided it through black operations to Saudi Arabia. It was clearly a false flag operation. But their entire agenda of going in there was completely thrown a loop in two parts. One, the British Parliament failed to go along, even though there's a lot of parliamentarians in Britain that are as controlled as our congressmen. They have a lot more leftist element, which is particularly upset with U.S. intervention around the world, and they simply outvoted the number of globalist-controlled parliamentarians in Britain. Major setback. The U.S. Then that energized our Congress to oppose this. It looks like it was going down to defeat in Congress. And then Kerry makes this slip up. In an offhand remark, he offers, well, obviously if they gave up their chemical weapons, which they aren't going to do, he said, we wouldn't have to attack. And Russia immediately telephoned Assad and said, accept the offer. Accept that you'll give up your land. We can stop this right now. A lot of people on the net have said, well, Russia's going to really stand up to the U.S. over Syria. They're not going to let it fall. I've always said in my World Affairs briefs that is not true. They have only been token responses to the U.S. The Russians are not ready to go up against the West in a full-scale World War III. So it's not going to deteriorate. In fact, Foreign Minister Lavrov says Russia isn't going to war with anybody, and it's true. If Russia wanted to stop the U.S. invasion, all they'd have to do is put two top-level Russian fighter squadrons into Syrian air bases, and the U.S. and Israel wouldn't attack a thing, and it wouldn't cost them anything. But Russia is very much, it's very important to Russia that they allow the U.S. to continue to build the reputation as the aggressor in the world, as the bully of the world. This then will justify their eventual intent to do a preemptive nuclear strike on the West, which they practice every year. I mean, it's no secret among our military that they know, even though our government is covering for Russian war preparations, our military knows that Russia and China are the ones that are going to strike us. It's not terrorism that's the main threat. So what is going to happen now? This has been set back. Russia and China have accepted the nuclear weapons or the chemical weapons stand down of Syria. They may try to still sabotage that with some timelines, with some negotiations, but they feel like they can control Syria now by having weapons inspectors in there. Syria is really hobbled in terms of their ability even to take part in any Middle Eastern war right now. So it looks to me like the emphasis has now switched to Iran again. The U.S. is beating the drums on Iran. They're having Netanyahu come visit the last week in September to talk about attacking Iran. So it looks like the U.S. feels like we got Syria bottled up now in these negotiations. They don't dare come out and act aggressively. So we're free to go back to Iran. So I see that the Iran preemptive strike by Israel is back on the table. I think we could see that coming up.
I noticed the same thing, and kudos to Russia and to Putin. That was a heck of a checkmate, so to speak, when they said accept right away. Not only does that basically say, all right, well, you just gave us the parameters of what we need to end this, but number two, now it's hard for another rebel attack of chemical weapons. You know who the perpetrator is of a next chemical attack if all the chemical weapons are seized. So it handcuffs the rebels and it handcuffs the U.S. It was well played, but I noticed the same thing you did. The dialogue immediately shifted back to Iran. Like they got us with this one politically, so let's just go right back to Iran. Of all that you just informed us of, the thing that strikes out at me most is, of all the variables, you think that retaliatory is the greatest variable. It's not protecting the dollar. It's not protecting the Strait of Hormuz or oil. You think it's retaliation capabilities that's the most important variable to the U.S.
There are some longer-term strategic goals in attacking Iran, and one of those is cutting off China's oil supply. That was one of the reasons for moving into Africa, into Libya in particular, where the Chinese had 30,000 oil workers, is you cut off China's oil gambit in Africa. Now you cut it off in Iran. This is the same thing they did in World War II, and their six-point plan to provoke Japan to attack is to cut off Japan's oil supplies in British-controlled Indonesian archipelago. And so I see this as a long-term strategic goal to force China into striking the West by cutting off their access to oil, which China is in desperate need to do this. So that's a long-term aspect there that I think we need to always keep in mind. Once again, though, China and Russia both need a blue water navy before they dare take on the West. They have to. China, for example, is going to take everything from Japan all the way down to Australia to lock up the back door to Russia, and while Russia concentrates on being the primary instigator of a nuclear preemptive strike. It won't be against American cities per se, but against American military. They intend to blackmail the West into submission after taking out the U.S. military, saying, and our own leaders, you see, will use that fact that we've had our military decapitated in a preemptive strike to come out of their bunkers and say, we have no way to prosecute this World War III except by joining together in a new global government, excluding the communists, finally, like they should have done in the UN, and talking everyone into ceding sovereignty to a new world order with military power. That's the one thing they didn't get with the United Nations, was military power as well as taxation power. They get both of those with this initiation of a third world war. It's also my analysis that to win this war, they'll have to make a backdoor deal with China to betray Russia sometime during the war, and after China has taken this ring of islands to the west, they'll betray Russia. Then Russia will have a two-front war and won't be able to win. So I predict that Russia will go down after World War III. Then there will be a new Cold War as China then looms as the next threat. That will justify the globalists saying, well, we have to keep this militarized world government intact because of the new Cold War threat of China. And so that's why I don't think we'll ever get our sovereignty back like we did after World War II. In other words, we'll stay with the global government. And I see that as the long-term ploy here. The Middle Eastern war, which will come because of the attack on Iran, and I think it will, if Syria is hobbled, as the U.S. intends it to do, it will be Hezbollah launching all out against Israel and Iran, the U.S. getting involved. I don't see this going to a nuclear third world war. It's too early for Russia and China. But I do see it consolidating the U.S. reputation as the bully of the world, the aggressor of the world. And Israel and the U.S. will be uniformly hated, except among those puppet Arab governments like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which are just, they're being held, how should I say, they've got a secret pact with the U.S. The U.S. guarantees that they'll keep them in power and keep them from being overthrown if they continue to play ball with the globalists in the war on terror.
That's the way I always describe Saudi Arabia to people. Basically, the U.S. guarantees that they won't let the peasants storm the castle of the oligarchy in Saudi, and in turn, Saudi promises them, free goodies, and one of their watchdogs. Staying on Russia for a moment and on current affairs, how do you view or summarize the Edward Snowden situation, also being recent news, and him seeking asylum in Russia, and all the attention that's been given the last 3 months or so?
Well, I have long said, and a few others as well, that the NSA has been spying on everything for over a decade, and they have. And the Snowden revelation simply confirmed that. I think the Snowden whistleblower scandal is legitimate. I don't think he's a plant. I think he is sincere, and he did specifically join Booz Allen in order to get the goods on the NSA, the thing that he had his eyes open to in the CIA. He's got a lot of more information. It will be dribbled out over time, continually keeping the government guessing about what will be new. But it's interesting how, with a complicit media, they have been able to thwart, at least domestically, all of the backlash that should have, I thought if anything would in fact induce the American people to rise up and say enough is enough, is a revelation that they're spying on everything, and it hasn't done that. They've simply micromanaged this by continuing to leak, well, we authorized this, they made a few mistakes in going beyond it here, but we'll slap their hands and we'll have some reforms. And it's just all a big lie. It's just like DARPA 10 years ago saying that the total awareness system was going to be dismantled. Not only was it not dismantled, they were in the middle of a major building project covered by the NSA, and it ended up what it is now. So I think universal spying on every private, especially the dangerous thing of having all of our financial data as well as all the telephone calls and all of the emails, means that it's very, very difficult for liberty, because they're watching, they're making lists, especially of anybody who has dissident views, critical of government, such as myself, are being put on lists. I don't believe any of the hype by disinformation experts. One of the most notorious is the one talking to Doug Hagman of the Intel Hub, claiming that he's part of Homeland Security, and he weekly talks to Doug Hagman, telling him what the powers that be are doing. If we just think about it, Gus, with total surveillance now of everything, there's no way anybody can talk to anybody on the right wing and not be shut down if, in fact, they were leaking out of school. These people are permissible leaks. Now, in terms of the Hagman contact, it is my view that, in fact, he's kind of a dummy in between. He's not really working for DHS. He has DHS people purposely leaking him misinformation, treating him as if he's an insider with them, but he's not. In other words, he's kind of a middleman go-between, and they're just leaking convenient information. The same thing with Lindsey Williams, who has these two insiders following along after the head of ARCO, Richfield, who the head of ARCO really was an insider, though I think he was more of a benevolent guy who saw what was going on. You have to really be evil to be a true insider. That's one of the criteria. But I think Lindsey Williams being played for the fool. As I say, nobody can leak constantly to somebody who claims to be on our side and announce it on Alex Jones every week and not be shut down if you're leaking out of school. It's just
we're having this conversation for all those people. We're having this conversation a week after the new Apple just released the fingerprint ID. So all the new and I just heard the Twitter CEO say, oh yeah, it's gonna, they might be using it for payment solutions and this and that. They're you're knowingly they're voluntarily gonna have a fingerprint on every American. They're put it on their phone, and that's how they're gonna pay for things, with their fingerprint and with their phone. And it's the Orwellian state is come to fruition, and you're right. I was surprised there wasn't even more backlash. But one thing that I was, I try to be the constant realist, but it made me optimistic to see both mainstream walking zombies, so to speak, on both sides, sort of at least agree on a lot of the serious stuff and a lot of the Snowden stuff. I saw a Republican and Democrat, your normal array of voters who don't agree on anything usually. They did, at least people were agreeing on those two common variables, and they were back to back. So that made me slightly optimistic. That being said, I wanted to switch gears for a moment and talk about another area of your expertise. We recently talked to Jeff Berwick, whose expat is the only way to go. Staying domestic is insane. I happen to keep an open mind in regards to, I think, some people, I'm not opposed to staying domestic. I'm not opposed to expatting. I'm not diversifying. And so I wanted to touch on both those things with you. First, for those who wanted to stay domestic, your level of expertise in that area is second to none. Where can you tell us a little bit about strategic relocation and where you think the best place to be is, and for those who are going to stay domestic and fully accept that something is inevitable down the road?
Well, it's first of all important to understand what the threats are. I am not an adherent in imminent economic collapse, even though, I'm an Austrian economist, according to the fundamentals, it should and could collapse at any time because of all of the bubbles that are built into the system. I mean, the derivatives bubble is huge, the hedge fund bubbles are huge, the stock market margins are huge, the percentage of margin purchases, all of these are bubbles that could collapse. But the key to that collapse would be the Fed pulling the plug. I've seen absolutely zero evidence that the Fed is going to pull the plug. I mean, even toning down on QE3 is simply a reflection of the fact that we've got some fairly high inflationary pressures building now, and they're going to tamp that down. That to me is a positive sign in the sense that I view them as being able to keep this current bailout economy going for another 10 years, even as long as inflation stays in the current range of 6 to 9 real inflation. We've been doing that for 20 years. The economy has adjusted and can still adjust to 6 to 9% inflation. And there is no need, as Peter Schiff claims, to go to hyperinflation. And, to do that, you really have to do a lot more monetary creation than the Fed is doing, given the fact that my estimates are that current outstanding dollars existing in the world are about 200 trillion. The Fed says about 75 trillion. They're not counting all the palletfuls of cash that they've been spending after the phony fall of the Soviet Union, giving all that money to the oligarchs. Afghanistan, Iraq, all of those have had pallets of cash going. There's the drug underground. All of those are done in dollars. Even in the Argentine banking collapse over a decade ago, over 500 billion came out of the mattresses just in Argentina that people were hoarding. So there's a tremendous amount of dollars that people have already accumulated and are holding on to as an ultimate value. And I don't see the collapse of the dollar happening under any circumstance as long as the Fed's willing to continue to keep the system afloat. One of the reasons I say that is that all other currencies are as weak or weaker than the dollar. In other words, the other currencies really like the fact that the dollar is inflating about 20% in terms of real terms, M2, because they can hide their own inflation then under that inflation of the dollar and keep them relatively on par in the Forex markets so that it doesn't show up. And so there isn't anybody against U.S. inflation except those of us who feel that we're being robbed of that. I don't see the petrodollar falling as long as the U.S. is still representing about 50% of imports, and Europe is also supporting a lot of the dollar usage of the petrodollar. The fact that China and Russia don't do transactions in dollars anymore doesn't really affect more than about 5 to 7% of international trade. So I don't see those things as collapse scenarios, especially when you realize the globalists have control of the Fed. Why would they subject themselves to the blame of an economic collapse when they can simply postpone it, keep people fat, dumb, and happy for another 10 years and wait till Third World War brings on all the changes they want to do, new currency, world government. And you can't have a new currency, by the way, without a world government. You've got to have some entity that everybody agrees upon is going to manage this fiat money.
I always tell people there's three variables for totalitarian regime. It's monetary, fiscal, and force. You need to print money, be able to tax it, and then need someone to ultimately collect the tax money and force people to use the money. So those are the three variables I always look at when thinking about authoritarian forces.
So, as I say, I think that I'm not a fan of economic collapse this year, last year, and it's incredible how many people have been getting these disinformation leaks from insiders in government saying, FEMA's preparing for a collapse in October, and FEMA's doing this, and the government's going to collapse, and they're just bogus. It's not happening at all, and it's not going to happen, in my opinion. I don't see any sign that the Fed's going to pull the plug on this. Um, and I think they can keep it going a lot longer than people think. In fact, I'm predicting there's going to be a mild inflationary recovery in the next 2 years. And so people are going to be able to recoup. Going back to your question about strategic relocation, a lot of people's homes and things were underwater. I think if they're going to relocate, the next 2 years are going to be the prime times where their inflationary values, not the real value, but inflationary values of their residences are going to recover. They'll be able to liquidate those and move to safer areas. The basic threat, besides war, which I think is the only thing that looms in the future, and I think it's still at least 8 to 10 years away, world war that'll be nuclear in nature with the U.S. attacked will be, in fact, the thing that brings down this economy. It brings down the social order, and it will take the government at least 6 months to recover or to start a recovery, and we'll probably see famine within a year or two after that because of the cutting off of the normal chains of supply and the growing chains. And there will be fallout. There will be some other things involved, though it isn't the end of the world. A nuclear winter is an anti-war, anti-nuclear hoax. It won't occur. Most radiation from fallout dissipates in 2 to 3 weeks. Unless they start hitting nuclear power plants, then you have a real long-term. But I don't see that in the Russian plans. They're out to basically decapitate the U.S. military, blackmail the U.S. and Europe into submission. We will not. In fact, the globalists, as I've said, want this war to hijack our sovereignty and turn it into a global government. But in terms of strategic relocation, people have to remember that it's that threat of social meltdown that isn't going to come next year with financial collapse, but is going to come when nuclear war comes, that you have to be prepared for. You cannot afford to be in the eastern seaboard where you have 1,000 people per square mile and expect to have a retreat even an hour or two away and not have that retreat overwhelmed with people fleeing the cities for months afterwards, pillaging as they go, looking for anything to eat because there's no productivity. And so my highest ratings, even though in strategic relocation I cover every state of the union, I give it all a rating based upon a multiple of factors. I tell, even in New York, New Jersey, Newark, where to find, if you've got to stay in the area, where to find some safety, but I'm realistic that it's only going to be short-term or medium-term, that you need to be into these low-density population areas out in the West if you're going to survive long-term. Highest rated area, for example, in my book, Strategic Relocation, is the Intermountain West. Even though Salt Lake City is not a safe city in and of itself, if you view that as the center of the Intermountain West, it's 1,100 miles from San Francisco. It's 700 miles through trackless desert from Los Angeles. It's 1,000 miles from Seattle. It's 500 miles from Denver across huge Rocky Mountains. I mean, people are not going to walk to these areas as refugees through those trackless, very dangerous areas to get through. And that's why in that Intermountain Basin, and I talk about, there's 4 or 5 states involved in that, that's where real long-term safety can be had. When you talk about the government threat, our globalist-oriented government, this conspiracy against liberty is ultimately the threat that we have to deal with. And a lot of people feel like, well, the solution is to get out of Dodge, get out of this country because our government's the problem. What they fail to realize is a couple of things which I point out in my new section in that book on international retreating, is that there is no other country in the world that has literally millions of potential resistors who are schooled in constitutionalism and the philosophy of liberty as there are in the United States. Canada's perhaps second because of its influence with the U.S., but there are a pittance in Canada compared to what I estimate the 20 million constitutional conservatives are people who lean towards, I won't take it, I will resist, open tyranny. I have a lot of experience in foreign countries. I read over 10 foreign languages. I speak 5. I've lived in Europe, in Latin America for many years. I know these countries well. And the big trap that I see the expat community not seeing, the blind spot they have, is they view the cheap, comfortable living they have now, the tax advantages, they view the excellent access to their money through electronic exchange as a paradise. I mean, what could be better than this? I mean, I've lived in these countries. I've lived in Uruguay, Argentina, El Salvador, Guatemala. I've been to Costa Rica, Panama, Chile, and I know these countries. It's a wonderful life. I've loved living there myself, and it's cheap. But it's not going to last. What people need to understand is globalism is a worldwide movement. It's not just in the United States. The British are involved. If you look at the Syrians, say, who are the yes men to the U.S. on Syria? The Brits are and the French are. The Germans are playing it cool, but they're yes men, as we know from the NSA spying scandal. These people are all involved in getting NSA spy data so they can keep track of their own politicians. The U.S., buys allegiance by saying, here's some dirt on your opposition. You need us, join this partnership. And they have joined.
You almost view it as you don't even see the borders. You view it as this is like the last bastion, essentially. That the end game for these people is to consolidate power and eliminate sovereignty worldwide. So to think you could hide off in South America or Asia, that's not in the cards. They're trying to consolidate power regardless of where you're hiding.
That's right. They're after dissidents wherever you are. And remember this, though. In Latin America, for example, even though, and I've just done a recent review of who's president of Latin America, there's always almost a 49-52% between far left and business globalist rightists. There are no free market parties except in Guatemala's a small one. In El Salvador, there used to be a small one. Guatemala has this free market university there, which is engendering a lot of really excellent stuff in Austrian economics. The Marroquin University in Guatemala City. It's a great, free market university. But it's really got still a very minor impact compared to the fact that the populace in Latin America are uniformly socialist. They love the government benefits. They can be bought off very easily. And the businessmen, have to be in bed with government in order to make a living. A tremendous amount of regulations. You got to pay off people to get your liberties, and you can get liberty by paying it off in Latin America. But it's not secure. The universities are all uniformly Marxist, and the bureaucracies in all of these governments are filled with Marxists. They can't wait until they can confiscate Americans' property and bank accounts someday, as they've done twice now in Mexico, and it can happen again. While about half of Latin America is tied into the BRICS union between Russia and China, the other half is controlled by the globalists. So if you think that you're going to escape the threat of globalism by going to Canada, where you have a government that's an absolute yes man to the globalists in the U.S., you're kidding yourself. If you think you're going to escape globalism by going to Panama, or Colombia or Mexico, which are very much tied into the globalists, and the opposition parties are tied into the Socialist International, which is controlled by Russia. So either way, they're not going to look kindly to American expats someday, and that's the trap I see, is you're lured down there for cheap living, but if you buy property down there are no guarantees down there, and worst of all, there's no support base to turn to resist, as there is in America. In America, you can get out in the far west, where constitutional conservatives are a very large minority. In no place are constitutional conservatives a majority in the United States. Even in Utah, just mainstream Republican conservatives.
Right.
But they can be turned, the mainstream conservatives can be turned more to the right here in the United States than they can be the middle of the road business conservatives in the States. We do have a very large minority of constitutional conservatives concentrated in the West. But generally speaking, the 20 million that I've ascertained are, real, true pro-resistance allies in this war against tyranny, are spread out pretty uniformly around the United States. Everybody feels like they're a minority. I look at my neighbors and I say, I can't talk to these people. They're just clueless. And they really have blinders. They don't want to know. They don't want to be disturbed. What I think is going to happen in this next war that happens where the United States is finally attacked is that because of the chaos, what keeps people from strategically relocating now is the job. The job keeps them in the urban areas. When that social unrest comes, there's going to be virtually nothing holding people anymore. The job is gone. The food is gone. The water's gone. There's no reason to stay. And when people start getting out on the roads and, if they're lucky, they've prepared some kind of retreat, someplace to go to, so they're not just in the arms of FEMA as they're streaming out. But the important thing is it separates people from those ties that bind them to the big urban areas. And I think we will see in the aftermath of that war a rearrangement of the demographics within the United States, that conservatives and Christians and other people, even though they might not be fully knowledgeable, will drift towards areas they feel inspired, where there's more liberty and where liberty is regrouping. And that's going to be these freer, less populated areas, Midwest and Far West, that I'm referring to. And I think in the aftermath of war, when government loses control for a period of time, there's a real possibility that we can, through the grace of God and His inspiration, band together, join together, formulate pockets of liberty. I'm not real optimistic of being able to reform and recapture the entire nation on behalf, because of the power of these conspiring groups that control courts, they control most of Congress, they control the dark side of the CIA, FBI, DEA, all of the law enforcement, and of course, naturally, the executive. So I'm not real optimistic about being able to overturn that. Even if you had a Ron Paul for president, he'd never be able to get the evidence on these people because they control the surveillance equipment. They would never deliver to him the goods on the surveillance proving treason by these globalists. And even if you got it, it'd be very unlikely that the courts, who are controlled by them, as proven by Judge Roberts turning at the last minute in favor of Obamacare, they control the courts, they wouldn't prosecute. So I view, in kind of an expat way, if we can't save the nation, at least we can have pockets of liberty reform that can resist the global government and say, we want our own sovereignty back again, and we're defining it here, and this is how we want to do it.
Yeah, to your point, the cancer is systemic. It doesn't matter who's in there at this point. The corruption is so in depth in every branch of government and so many agencies that I agree. That's why I think the answer is, to your point, like a decentralization, decentralized power and pockets of liberty and prosperity, and ultimately people will go. I wanted to wrap it up with my final question. What do you say to those who are slightly limited in their capital or disposable income? How should they prioritize what's most important in preparation of relocation or war or whatever may come? If you had someone with a limited budget to deal with and limited disposable income, what would you tell them is most important in your eyes?
Well, Gus, I consult with people 2 or 3 times a day as part of my profession about relocation. And it's interesting that 90% of everyone I deal with, when I ask them what's driving you towards calling me and needing my service, it's financial collapse. I've got to move within the next 6 months or I'm toast. So the first thing I have to do is straighten people out. No, you have time. It's not going to collapse. The powers that be are not going to take the blame for this. They're going to postpone this thing out. So you've got time to do this right. That not only means finding the time to find it, but the time to reorient your finances, your job, move, take the time to get a new job, start a new business. You still, if I'm right, about 8 to 10 years before this war comes, they're going to keep hobbling along. You've even got time to start a business and make it go if you pick things that are holes in the market, especially if there's going to be a mild inflationary recovery. So that's my first message, is that don't accept your poverty or don't accept your limited financial as that you have to do something within that. What I do suggest, first of all, is that while the market is just starting to emerge, try to tie up the property that you want, even if it's making payments to it, so that that price is locked in. Then when the inflation rises and you can then get out of your underwater house and other things and sell them, then you can leverage towards that. Secondarily, full self-sufficiency is very expensive. We design high-security residence and retreats all over the nation, and it's not cheap. And it does require maintenance. The more sophisticated the system of self-sufficiency, there is maintenance so that you've got learning to do. It doesn't take money to learn. You don't have to go back to school. Internet resources are abundant, that you can be studying and practicing, learning to fix cars, learning to fix your own appliances. Those are money in the bank someday. Thirdly, I say, everybody can cut back on, expenses, whether it's going out to dinner or movies or, cable television. Really cut back to the bone so that you are putting things away. But I don't recommend people stockpile a tremendous amount of the expensive freeze-dried foods. I really think that it's cheaper to concentrate on the bulk foods, the rice, the beans, and the wheat, because those are going to feed you for a lot longer, pound per pound, than the sophisticated, dried foods. And they're just tremendously cheaper. The downside of that is they're heavy. And if you're going to relocate, you don't want to be stockpiling, a ton of these grains and other things and then have to pay to move those things again. And so you've got to kind of work with, if you've got a schedule to move within a year or two, then you can buy a little bit so that you're safeguarded in case there's a short-term problem. But I don't foresee the long-term big problem for 8 to 10 more years, so you've got time to strategically plan the move. If you really can never afford it, then you have to join forces with other people. Friends, families, trusted. Don't go to survival groups, however. I have consulted enough in my life to know that survival groups and organizations always split apart. Survivalists don't do well together. They're all independent-minded. They're all bullheaded. And they always factionalize. So don't go looking for a survival community. Just find like-minded people that you know and trust personally and get together. And I've also found that religious groups that get together don't do well. They always end up with a strongman leader, and there's either embezzlement or ego problems, and they end up having doctrinal other falling apart. It's really better to have a more ecumenical people that you trust character-wise and personality-wise that you get along with, rather than going for some ideological purity system.
Yeah, I often make the statement that it's ironic that so many of us are champions of individualism, but we find it absurd when someone disagrees with us. It's almost hypocritical in nature. You have been far too kind with your time, and we thank you so much for coming on. If you could tell our listeners and where to find you, where the best place to follow your stuff, pick up your books, all of the above, where could our listeners find you?
Okay. Well, first of all, for my World Affairs briefings, these come out every Friday, once a week, modest subscription fee. You can go to worldaffairsbrief.com to subscribe and to see the summary of the current brief. You can also get a free sample copy of the current brief by simply emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. Now, my books are showcased on my website, joelskousen.com. That's last name is Skousen. And all four of my major books are there, available to review. They can be purchased online or any way that you want them. Strategic Relocation, The Secure Home, that's my big 700-page book on everything about high security construction and self-sufficiency. The High Security Shelter book is an architectural plan book about how to do a safe room in an existing basement, the cheapest alternative for most people. And I also have a booklet on preparedness lists called 10 Packs for Survival. But all those are available on joelskousen.com.
Superb. Mr. Skousen, thanks again for joining us, and hopefully you'll come back and see us again soon.
Great. A pleasure, Gus.
Likewise, sir. Likewise.